Welcome everyone to this edition of the Doorstep Book Talks. I'm your co-host, senior fellow here at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also senior fellow here at Carnegie. So excited to show you my dog-eared copy of Chris Miller's Chip War. Chris teaches at the International in History at Tufts University's Fletcher School, also serves as Jean Kirkpatrick Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and is really the premier person to talk to about the most important thing we could possibly talk about in 2023, in April of 2023, chips, why they're important, why we need to pay more attention. And this book, I think, does so many things, Chris. So let me first congratulate you on the book. And second, say that I learned so much. And I encourage our audience not only to pick up this book, listen to our talk today, pick up this book, forward it to all of your friends, but because this makes you feel smart. And I say this because this is a very complex, I'm not an engineer. Most of our listeners today probably aren't, if I may venture to guess. But this really nails down why this industry is so impactful and is so important. And I think you do it in a variety of ways. And one of the most important to me as a journalist is all of the scene setting you do and all of the look at people. Because when I say chip or when you say semiconductor, to the average person, their eyes might glaze over. Or they might feel terrified because some media outlet has hyped the crisis in the supply chain, which turns out isn't so much a crisis, but we'll get to that. But this really narrows it down to the people who made the difference. And that's why I really appreciate this book. And if I can, I'm gonna start out with the scene that you ended with, because I really love the scene of in December 1958, 65 years ago, when you had Morris Chang, Pat Haggerty, Weldon Ward, Jay Lathrop, and Jack Kilby from Texas Instruments, Wintry, DC, talking to Chang, Gordon Moore, Bob Noyce, who were out for beers. And they started this industry, this great industry that has transformed our lives exponentially in 65 years. I want to talk about those people and their impact, not only on the US, but globally, and kind of how you found them and what your process was to start this book, because it's an interesting way to get into something that people normally view in the purview of engineering or military. How did you start that and end that with these people?
Well, thanks, Tatiana and Nick as well for the introduction and the invitation to join you both today. It's interesting, Tatiana, you started with the question about the people, because the people were what really actually drew me into this topic. And some of the people that you mentioned in that scene from 1958 are obvious characters in the story, like Jack Kilby or Bob Noyce, who are the two individuals who get the credit for inventing the first chips. And there have been books written about them on the development of the technology, but the people that stood out to me alongside those inventors were also the people who built the industry itself. And I was, I think, expecting to end up writing a story that was more about inventors, and I have great respect for the inventors, but I ended up concluding that next to the inventors, we also need to take just as seriously the people that made the inventions economically, financially, logistically viable. And so there were, next to those inventors, a number of people like Morris Chang, who you mentioned, who wasn't an inventor per se, but he was the person who more than anyone else played just a fundamental role in making it possible to mass manufacture devices. And I think that gets to a key challenge that we all face when we think of technology, because we often think of technology as being about producing a small number of very complex things. But what I realized over the course of this research is that it's often easier to produce a small number of things than it is to produce many, many, many things. And what's made chips revolutionary is that now we can't live our lives without them because they're embedded in all aspects of economy and society.
Yeah, let's just read your sentence. Last year, which I think was 2021, the chip industry produced more transistors than the combined quantity of all goods produced by all other countries in all other industries in all human history. All human history. And I think that's what really started to coalesce, that it's not just this phone or this computer that we're on. It is all products, everything that touches our daily lives. This is so important at the doorstep, everything that touches our daily lives. And we really need to understand where this is coming from. And I think the biggest sentence that I say to people from this book that they do not believe, so let's delve right in. Taiwan's TSMC builds almost all the world's most advanced processor chips. I think that we read about Taiwan in the news and the potential war, and people do not connect the fact that TSMC is such a big player today. I really don't. And so maybe if we can tie our people talk with because there were very important people that made this happen, from the US side, from the Taiwanese side, that make what happened, 60 years ago, very relevant and important today.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue with the character that I mentioned, Morris Chang, who is, I think, one of the most underestimated entrepreneurs of the last 100 years. Just a bit on Morris Chang's background, which will then end up with the Taiwanese company that you mentioned. He was born in China before the revolution, fled because his father was an official of the nationalist government, so he had to flee the communists when they took power. Enrolled at Harvard, planning to study English literature. His uncle told him to study something serious and get a real job, so he moved to MIT and studied physics and electrical engineering, and was eventually hired by Texas Instruments, helped build up Texas Instruments as a real critical player in the chip industry, and then in 1987 founded TSMC in Taiwan around a unique business model, which was about only manufacturing chips, not doing any design, just doing the manufacturing. And since that point, over the past now over 35 years, he's turned TSMC into the world's biggest chip maker, also the world's most advanced chip maker. And so today, almost all smartphones, many PCs, our telecoms infrastructure, our data centers, all of them rely on the most advanced chips, which TSMC produces 90% of.
And I think the point here with Taiwan is that most people didn't realize until, and I think you posit in your book, until the Trump administration, the strategic importance of that. So not just the business importance of what was happening in global supply chain, but the strategic importance. Can you talk to a little bit about when and does the government today, because we have a big meeting, because there's other players, but we have a big meeting today between the US and South Korea. Before I move to South Korea though, let's talk about what happened in terms of US policy and understanding where we had left maybe things lying on the table that we weren't paying attention to, and how what happened under Trump has really led us to the CHIPS Act.
Yeah, well, I think to tell the story completely, you want to rewind the clock by about 10 years. Because it was 10 years ago when, or in 2014, so 9 years ago, when China, which is a small player in the chip industry, but has big ambitions, began identifying semiconductors as a key focus of its industrial policy, and passed a number of important industrial policy programs, of which the most famous is Made in China 2025, but there are a bunch of others, and tried to pour money into its chip industry and win a bigger market share for itself. And that was happening partly for economic reasons, but also partly for strategic reasons, because the Chinese government was concerned that today they're the world's biggest importer of chips. And today China spends as much money each year importing chips as it spends importing oil. So it's a real vulnerability for Chinese leaders. And they import chips almost exclusively from the US and US allies, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, etc. And so a decade ago, China started pouring money into the chip industry. And that coincided somewhat coincidentally with China's growing military power and average. And so China's been building up its military over the past several decades, but in the past decade, it's really begun to shift the military balance in Asia, which has worried a number of governments, Taiwan, Japan, the United States. And so there was both an economic and a security aspect to this. And the implications of this were actually first recognized in places like Taiwan, like Japan, which were, they're closer to China, they're more embedded in electronic supply chains. And so realized the implications of what was potentially happening first. And it wasn't until 2016, 2017, 2018 that in Washington, alarm bells started to go off, not only about the economic implications if U.S. firms were to be edged out by these government programs that were supporting new Chinese firms, but also about the potential military implications. And I think that's important to recognize, because although today most chips that are produced end up in civilian applications, smartphones, PCs, the origins of the industry is, of course, in missile systems, missile guidance computers. And today, like in the early Cold War, when defense ministries think about semiconductors, they see a component that is absolutely critical to most of their advanced technology.
Chris, if I could, and this is a fascinating conversation about supply chains, dependencies, and I can't help but this is for pop culture references. Think that if they remade the James Bond View to a Kill movie, which was destroying Silicon Valley in the 1980s in order to cripple the chip industry, and today it would be Taiwan, and that's of course the worry, right? That something happens to Taiwan and chip manufacturing is impacted. But you then see a lot of people saying, well, okay, so just open factories up somewhere else. Go to Arizona, go to India, go somewhere else. What is it about the production of semiconductor chips in how we've set up the kind of production? Why is it so concentrated in Taiwan? And how easy or how difficult is it to just say, fine, close the factory in Taiwan, box it up, move it to Arizona, and problem solved? I mean, why is it that we have this physical concentration of the manufacturing? First it was Silicon Valley, then Taiwan seems to have really to have surged ahead to become the place, which, as you say about with Morris Chang, right? That Morris Chang's thing was, I'm going to make these. I'm not going to design them. They'll do that somewhere else, but I'm going to actually physically make the physical chips. And as you said, China is dependent, and that's a fascinating statistic, the idea that as much as it has to import oil, it has to import chips. And then you think of how the implications in so many areas, not only for China, but obviously Russia now getting chips from China in order to try to maintain its as you said, back to the original purpose of maintaining missile systems. And we know that Chinese components are finding their way into Russian weaponry. But what is it about why Taiwan? Why did that become the choke point? And how easy or how difficult is it to say, fine, we'll just create manufacturing somewhere else?
Well, it'll be very difficult to begin to shift the base of where manufacturing happening. We're trying to do so slowly via the CHIPS Act, but it's going to take a long time. And there are two reasons why it's difficult. The first is cost, and the second is complexity. So first off, on cost, if you want to build an advanced chipmaking facility, it'll cost around $20 billion. And so these are the most expensive factories in human history. And these are facilities that are cutting edge for a couple of years before there's a new type of chip making technology that comes along with exponentially better capabilities, at which point your $20 billion facility is second rate. And so just to put that into context, if you want to buy a cutting edge aircraft carrier, it'll cost you $10 billion. And it'll be in service, the US Navy hopes, for half a century. Whereas a chip facility costs twice as much and is cutting edge for a couple of years. So the cost is truly enormous, which is why, although institutions like the Pentagon, which has an $850 billion budget, used to produce chips in-house, decided over a decade ago it had to outsource. We've got specialized facilities for making aircraft carriers, but not for semiconductors. And so the Pentagon, in every advanced fighter jet, there are chips that can only be made in Taiwan. And the Pentagon's decided that's the most efficient way given the cost. But the cost is actually the easier part to solve than the complexity. because making an advanced semiconductor is the most complex manufacturing humans have ever undertaken, full stop. So if you go to the Apple store and buy a new iPhone and open up the iPhone, you'll find dozens of semiconductors inside, but just the most important one will have 15 billion transistors carved into it. And a transistor is just a switch that turns a circuit on or off. When it's on, it's a 1, off, it's a 0. And these transistors produce all the 1s and 0s undergirding digital computing. And your smartphone has 15 billion or so of these transistors carved into just the primary chip. And the chip is roughly the size of your fingernail. And in order to fit 15 billion of them on a chip the size of your fingernail means that each one of them has to be roughly the size of a virus. And they're produced with basically perfect accuracy in every single chip that's made. So there's nothing that comes close to this level of manufacturing complexity. We measure the size of these transistors in nanometers, which is billionths of a meter. And in order to produce these things, we've had to create a whole new set of manufacturing tools, of chemicals, of software, of design processes, which previously didn't exist. And it's worked marvelously, but it's been just horrifically complex and expensive, which is why today there are only 3 companies in the entire world that are anywhere close to producing cutting-edge processor chips, and Taiwan has 90% of the market.
And I just follow up on that question. There's a great map in your book. So for those, again, get the book. It's amazing. There's a great map and glossary. I love the glossary. I love the people glossary. I love the tech glossary. But I love the map of where semiconductors are produced. And if you can tell online, that looks like East Asia. That is not the US. That is not the Middle East. That is not Latin America. That is not Africa. And I think that this is a really big deal in terms of connecting the dots on why administrations, US administrations, talk about a pivot to Asia, right? I think that your book really succeeds in connecting diplomacy and business and the past and the future in ways that I think are really important for us to understand where we're going, in the next generation of products and technology. I want to go back to, how this map was created, why it happened, and maybe talk a little bit and go back to why Taiwan. And it really was a business decision initially, right? So even though the US government, in Vietnam, you have great examples of how they were the first to kind of put these guided missiles into action. And it really was the opportunity that I think you had the little sign of the engineers, I want to get rich, right? That's what they wanted to do with these products. And the decision to outsource to Taiwan, to Korea, to Japan was really based on cost and labor. And if we could look at why that still makes sense today and what our competitive advantage is in the US for our audience, in order to understand why that system isn't going to change on a dime. Yes, it's because of cost and complexity, but it's also maybe it's not globalization. I'm going to use the term that I found in your book, weaponized interdependence.
Well, it's a great question, and it does force us to rewind back the clock again half a century, because the chip industry began offshoring some assembly and then production since basically the earliest days of the industry. The first chip was invented in 1958, and the first offshore assembly facility in Hong Kong was set up in 1963, so 5 years after the industry set up. So this process of internationalization or offshoring is in the industry's DNA, and it is important, or was important at the outset, because, as you say, the labor cost differentials were huge. And from the earliest days, chip making involved both brilliant engineering and expensive capital equipment, but also, for certain parts of the production process, lots of labor. And so in the earliest days of the industry, there was gluing of wires that had to happen by hand, for example. And it's still the case that there's a fair amount of labor-intensive work at the end of the chip making process. So all of the nanometer scale manufacturing today happens by tools that are highly automated. But when you're taking a chip and putting it into a smartphone or a PC, there's some labor that's needed there. And that's part of the process that basically has to happen today in countries with lower wages than the US. What's changed in the past several decades is that it's not only the labor-intensive parts that are happening in the US. So the assembly is happening offshore. But today also a lot of the fabrication, the actual manufacturing step is also happening offshore. And this is not solely due to labor differentials. If you look at the cost of a advanced chip making facility, what you'll find is that over the lifetime of the facility, around 70% of the cost is the machines inside of it. These ultra precise complex machines that are capable of doing this minute manufacturing. And those machines cost the same regardless of which country you install them in. So the capital costs are roughly the same. Labor cost differentials between the US and Taiwan or US and Korea are there are labor cost differentials, but these are not low wage countries. And so the key reason why Korea and especially Taiwan have become centers of chip manufacturing has more to do with the companies in particular that have been set up there. The fact that the huge capital investment has been treated very favorably by those countries' tax systems, and by the fact that those countries and those companies have been willing to pursue very capital intensive investment strategies, which is expensive and is often not the most profitable way to produce. And so what we've seen over the last several decades is that US firms have focused on designing chips. And chip design doesn't require a lot of upfront investment. You just hire designers, you buy a couple of software tools, and then you get chips that are designed. Chip manufacturing requires huge upfront investment, billions and billions of dollars to build these facilities. And they're both roughly equally profitable, which means that you're much better off in the chip design space from a purely financial perspective, which is why there are US firms like NVIDIA or AMD or Apple, which most people don't think of as a chip design firm, but actually designs some semiconductors, which have done very, very well financially by just focusing the design and outsourcing the expensive part, the manufacturing, to a couple of companies in Asia.
You mentioned those companies, and then you spent a lot of time talking about Intel here and how Intel lost some of its competitive advantage. And I wonder, is that a reflection of the U.S. kind of losing, sight of the prize? And is Intel's struggle to get it back our struggle as well?
Well, I think there were some structural factors across the U.S. that impacted Intel, but impacted everyone. For example, I think we've all, when we conceptualize advanced technology, we think of social media and we think of search engines rather than advanced manufacturing, even though it's the ability to manufacture chips that makes social media possible. And I think that's been an intellectual error on our side. We've underplayed the importance and the significance and the fascination behind advanced manufacturing. I think the fact that our software firms are so profitable has let them pay very, very high wages, which is great in some ways, but it's also meant that if you're an undergraduate deciding between a degree in computer science or material science, well, the labor market is telling you go to computer science. And that's made it harder for firms in the chip industry to attract as many engineers as they've needed because there have been so many good jobs in the software space. So that's another structural factor that's impacted the entire industry. I think on top of that, the government in the US has been less supportive of the chip industry than in other countries. And I don't mean primarily in terms of financially supportive, although there's some truth to that, but it's also just a question of making life easy for chip making. Chip making, first off, it requires a lot of toxic chemicals, and there's all sorts of environmental permits that we understandably require chip makers to take out before they build a facility. But we've been a lot slower at approving those permits than in Taiwan or Korea or Japan, or even in Europe, actually. It takes longer to build a chip making facility in the US than in Europe. And so we've been bad at permitting and therefore slowed down manufacturing in terms of cost. So those are some of the structural factors that have existed across the industry. I think Intel, which was until recently the world's biggest chip maker, for a long time, one of its most successful chip makers, faced a number of unique circumstances about a decade ago that caused it to miss some opportunities. I think the primary driver of Intel's challenges is that it was too successful for too long. Intel chips were at the center of the PC industry when PCs were a growing business. Most PCs had an Intel chip inside. Then they were at the center of the early days of the data center and cloud computing business. And so they had these almost monopolies in these two critical markets. And what it meant was that the company under the previous CEOs struggled to take advantage of new opportunities. And so there's a famous moment where Steve Jobs came to Intel in the 2000s and said, I've got this idea for a phone that will work like a computer. Would you like to make chips for it? And Intel's old CEO said, it sounds like a low volume product with mediocre margins. and boy, that was the wrong bet. So I think now Intel, because it's faced a couple of difficult years over the past several, it's now in a very different position. It realizes that it has to innovate in terms of product, in terms of technology, to regain its top position. And so I think we've seen a very different both strategy, but also I think a very different level of focus on innovation over the past couple of years, precisely because unlike in the past where it had an almost monopolistic position, now it's got a real fight in its hands with the other leaders in the chip industry.
When you're giving that story about Jobs going to Intel, it's just so interesting how many times in Steve Jobs's lifetime, big companies passed on opportunities. I'm just thinking of the time that it was actually more Steve Wozniak goes to HP with what was the design for the Apple, and HP passes on it by saying, this is exactly the same thing as with smartphones, PCs. Why would people want computers? It's the big institutions, and so it's interesting that seems to have been a pattern in Apple's history of pioneering products that established firms decided weren't worth pursuing. But as you're discussing all of this, you're discussing the real difficulties in standing up these kind of facilities. That it's not a question of calling up Taiwan, boxing up a factory, sending it over, reassembling it in Arizona, which is, I think, what some people popularly had in mind, or we see coming out of India, that India is saying, look, we can become the new Taiwan, just send us and make the investments here. That, the complexity, the cost, and then, you have to be willing to deal with the trade-offs, including, as you note, the environmental ones, which suggests that there is a dependency that we will have to learn to live with, that this isn't something that is just going to be solved in a matter of a year and a half, 2 years. And it comes back to this weaponized interdependence question, and maybe asking you to just sort of, speculate moving forward. Is there, and I'm struck by it, and sorry, it's maybe a somewhat of an obscure historical reference, but we know from the ancient world in the Middle East that, people, Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, when they would fight, one of the things that they would agree not to touch were the olive groves, because olive groves were so important. The oil was necessary. Olive groves were difficult. And so you might sack the city and destroy the city, but you left the olive groves alone. Is there something, do you see, and you just said China's dependent, we're dependent. Is there, with weaponized interdependence, is there going to be a move to where we say, hey, we're not sure about the final status of Taiwan, but we all need these chips, and we need the exports to continue. Or can countries survive? Can their industries, can their products survive if there is this sudden interruption of Taiwanese chips? And of course, what happens if Mother Nature decides to send another tsunami or massive earthquake that damages Taiwan? I mean, do we have the capacity to survive a potential interruption in Taiwanese supply? Or do we all have now this shared interest? China and the US both have to agree that no matter what their disagreements, the chips must flow in order for the global economy to function. I mean, it's just fascinating, this notion of coming to grips with weaponized interdependence with something that is so vital to the global economy and to our day-to-day lives, with 90% of the supply coming from Taiwan. That would suggest that we all need to make sure nothing happens to Taiwan over the next number of years.
Well, I think if something were to go wrong in the Taiwan Straits and we were to have a disruption or a destruction of Taiwan's chip making capabilities, the results would be no less than catastrophic for the world economy. There's no alternative source of supply. We don't have spare capacity they could easily bring online. And it would take years to rebuild that capacity in other countries. And in the interim, it's not just that we'd struggle to produce smartphones or PCs, it's autos. A new car will have 1,000 chips inside on average. It's dishwashers, it's microwaves, it's airplanes. Good luck producing an airplane anywhere in the world. So the economic costs would be horrific. We'd be at Great Depression level of disruption to manufacturing. And so I think that, the optimistic view is that that does provide a very strong incentive for everyone to keep the peace around Taiwan. And I think that optimistic view might be right, but I'm not super confident that it's right. And I think we can find lots of instances historically where interdependence has not guaranteed peace. And all of the disastrous wars that have emerged throughout history weren't started because they were expected to be disastrous wars. They developed into disastrous wars after a series of calculated risks taken by leaders of countries, some of which were based on reasonable bets that went wrong, and others of which were based on just bad bets in the first place. We got one example of this just from last year of a bet gone horribly wrong. And I think, there's a million differences between the situation in Europe and the situation in the Taiwan Straits, but I am struck by the extent to which the don't cut down the olive groves logic would have also applied to natural gas infrastructure in Europe. And it was a casualty very, very early on. And so I worry about putting too much faith into this thesis, not because I think it's not true, but because I'm not sure that it's true. And that uncertainty makes me nervous.
Thank you for the question from the audience. I want to remind our audience, we are taking your questions. This is a book talk. We might not be able to see all of you, but we want you to feel like you're in the room with us. So please send in your questions. We have a question here that I think is important because there are other players in this industry. I stress Taiwan because it's just been the thing that I've been talking to people about that they seem not to understand as the number one thing that's not understood. But there are many other things we can talk about. So here from Peter Nowitzki, asking about other chip makers. What about AMD or ARM, ASML? Where do all these other businesses fit? And I know that your entire book talks about that. So that's a little bit much, but if you can, maybe just give us a little bit of a roadmap so that we understand where we are.
It's actually a great question. And I think it probably helps to lay out a bit of the details as to where different companies fit in. And if you talk about the chip industry, you're actually talking about firms that do a whole number of different things, because the production process requires companies that specialize in different parts of the supply chain. So what does that mean? First off, there are companies that design the software tools that are used to design chips. Second, there are companies that actually design chips themselves. And this is where AMD, for example, fits in, ARM as well, fits in roughly in this level. They produce chip designs, but they don't do any manufacturing themselves. AMD manufactures 0 chips. It only designs them. And then AMD will take its designs to Taiwan, to TSMC, which will then do the manufacturing. But TSMC is only capable of manufacturing these chips by acquiring materials, ultra specialized chemicals, for example, and also machine tools from companies like ASML, which Peter mentioned. And ASML produces one of the types of tools needed to make chips called a lithography tool, which shines rays of light to create patterns on chips. That's a very, very, very oversimplified description of what it does, but that's what it does. And so ASML as well produces no chips, designs no chips, does almost nothing but produce these lithography tools. And yet their tools are used in most chipmaking facilities around the world and in every single advanced chipmaking facility around the world. And so within the chip industry writ large, there are actually a lot of firms that don't produce any chips because they either design them, they produce chemicals or software, or they produce the tools that are used to manufacture chips. And so TSMC has these extraordinary capabilities, which we've discussed, but it can only do so by drawing on the expertise and the products of the rest of the supply chain. And that's what makes this industry, I think, so interesting, is that there's not a single company, nor is there a single country that can produce advanced chips on their own. It requires cooperation between firms in Europe and Japan and the US and Taiwan and Korea. And so this international supply chain is really core to how the industry operates.
That's a fascinating point because we say that Taiwan produces 90%, but then Taiwan's capacity to do this is impacted then by these other suppliers. And again, we're back to these questions of these interdependent supply chains and can they be weaponized and so on and so forth. You talked a bit earlier, and you've continued to talk about, look, there's a lot of cost and complexity. In advance of your appearance with us today, in advance of the book talk, Mohammed Solomon had tweeted out this morning that yes, the US and Europe are going to devote X billions of dollars to building facilities, but that China pretty much is, triple the investment. In essence, kind of portraying this as a race to see who can and who will build alternate facilities. Do you have a gut sense as you look at the CHIPS Act, as you look at the proposals in Europe? Obviously, the PRC is very good at making announcements. Sometimes delivery or fulfillment may not always match the initial rhetoric. And then, of course, India over the last year, a lot of both governmental and then private industry figures have been saying India is poised to duplicate what Taiwan has done. Do you have a sense as you're looking forward over the next 5 to 7 years, are we going to see, the 90% figure for Taiwan drop and then it'll be 60% comes from Taiwan? Where would the rest come from? Will they come from the US, from Europe, from India, from the PRC, from the mainland? Are there other players in this space that we're not paying attention to that we might be surprised by that, maybe we had on the one of our earlier Doorstep guests, Ambassador Charles Ray was talking about we overlook Africa's potential as a manufacturer. Could we be talking about, what Taiwan did in the 60s, an African state could do in the 2030s? I mean, what's your sense as to how the industry itself and how much do governments then put their finger or their thumb on the scale to influence those outcomes?
So I think a lot depends on which types of chips you're talking about. And then also if you look further down the electronic supply chain, which types of electronics assembly you're talking about. And so if you envision a smartphone, from the production of the chips all the way to the completion of a smartphone, there are lots of different companies involved. There's the main processor chip in your smartphone, which is probably produced at TSMC in most cases, but then there are lots of other chips in your smartphone, some of which require the most advanced production processes, others of which don't. In your phone, there's a chip for the Bluetooth, there's a chip for the Wi-Fi, there's a chip for the camera, there's a chip for the audio, and not all of those have to be at the most cutting edge production processes. I think we're likely going to see some reduction in Taiwan's market share at the cutting edge. You mentioned the facility in Arizona that TSMC is building. Intel is also trying to expand its capacity to produce these ultra cutting edge chips. But we're not going to see a collapse in Taiwan's role. So I think today it's 90, maybe we go down to 70 over some time horizon. That seems plausible to me, but it's not going to be down to 30 or 20 or 10. So Taiwan will stay, I think, very, very important at the cutting edge. But then for other types of chips, you have different dynamics. So in memory chips, which are also very important, Korean firms are actually the largest player. Today, Korean firms produce memory chips both in Korea and in China, but actually they're in the process of removing their production from China and refocusing it on Korea. And so we could have, for certain types of advanced memory, more concentration of production in Korea than we do today. And then for less advanced types of chips that require less sophisticated manufacturing processes, we've got a huge build out around the world, with India, as mentioned, focusing on these less advanced chips, Japan focusing on more foundational chips, and then China. Most of its investment dollars are going to building out these types of foundational chips, which are not the most sophisticated in terms of their production, but are in everything, in your dishwasher, in your car, in your smartphone, in your PC. And China's building out huge capacity. And so there's a risk that because everyone is building out capacity in these foundational chips, there's a risk that there's overcapacity at the global level, which could set off a new round of trade disputes over the coming years. And there's also uncertainty as to which companies in which countries will win market share in the foundational chips. Then the next step is to ask, well, who's going to be doing the assembly of all these different chips into the plastic case of your phone or your PC? And the assembly process traditionally has taken place mostly in China. Today, China assembles around 90% of all smartphones, a slightly smaller share of PCs and servers, but a large share. And that's where you're seeing, I think, really rapid shift right now, because the companies that do the production of phones and PCs are trying to get more diversification, and Vietnam, India, elsewhere in Southeast Asia, Mexico are going to play a much bigger role in the assembly of all of the chips into phones and PCs.
Sorry, Chris, I just, since you mentioned dishwashers, and I think it's important to mention this as well, that, you know, that we don't think of dishwashers as being particularly that advanced, but that, yes, they have chips. And as we've seen from, you know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, people laughed up the idea of, oh, they're stealing dishwashers and bringing them back. But, you know, if they have chips that can be used, it may not be that you're taking a dishwasher because you expect to wash your dishes. It's because you want to get the chips inside, and that we don't think that so many of our daily products contain these high-tech products.
Yeah, so I think this leads into the question then, because of all this interdependence. We have a question from Dean Chatterjee. Isn't weaponized interdependence the underlying reason that dictates global geopolitics? We can get into his further, you know, what does that mean for democracy and sovereignty? But I do think that it means that governments are super involved. And as you have mentioned and alluded to, the Taiwanese government was very involved in funding its semiconductor industry in Taiwan. Similarly, in China, I mean, the Chinese government is making huge investments. And, you know, I'm going to attack this interdependence question by an example you had in the book of how, you know, IBM or an Apple wants to get the Chinese market, but they have to, but in order to do that, then the government gets involved with a tariff, and then that impacts the business of a large company. And there's this dance then that happens, you know, how much can the government get involved in, you know, regulating trade? How much should it be involved in regulating trade? Or should it let companies just do their own thing? Or when does it become a strategic security issue? And that, I think, needs to be more understood and talked about. So maybe we can get at Dean's question from that angle.
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting and complex and hard to answer question, I think. You know, on the one hand, there's a school of thinking dating back to Kant or perhaps earlier that economic interdependence produces peace. And there's plenty of reasons to think that dynamic is sometimes true. But we've also seen, and there's some great work by the political scientists who coined the phrase weaponized interdependence. I borrow it from them, and it's not my own phrase. In thinking through, well, is it always true that economic interdependence produces peace, or is sometimes interdependence a sphere where competition can move to? And what we've seen in the electronics industry over the past decade is that we've had competition between countries moving to the sphere of electronic supply chains. And this creates, I think, interesting policy dilemmas, because on the one hand, it's very clear that businesses have invested a lot of money in their businesses, and so lobby their governments to make sure that politics doesn't get in the way of their business. We see this time and time again. On the other hand, and so if that's true, insofar as that's true, business lobbying is actually a stabilizing force, because businesses will tell their governments, don't mess this up, our business model depends on it. And so that dynamic is present to some degree. On the other hand, we also see governments looking at their vulnerabilities, their reliance on other countries, and saying, we've got to find ways to mitigate these vulnerabilities, which usually means reducing interdependence. And so what's happening in the chip industry right now is an effort by the US and also simultaneously by China to reduce their interdependence on each other. And both countries are doing so because they believe they'll be in a better competitive position if they're less dependent. It also probably, though, creates the dynamic in which you've got fewer interests who are lobbying for stability in the relationship. And so it creates a more unstable bilateral dynamic, even though both sides are taking steps that they believe will make themselves more secure. So it makes me think about the security dilemma in international security, where both sides build up their arms to feel more secure, but the dynamic is an arms race that makes everyone less secure. I think we've got similar sets of dynamics in the economic sphere today, where both sides are taking steps to make themselves more economically secure. And there's an open question as to, is the end result a situation in which we're more economically secure in aggregate after everyone takes these competitive steps? I don't know that the answer to that question is that we end up being less secure. I think it's a sphere where we're still learning in real time what the impacts are. But I think we certainly should be cognizant of the fact that security dilemma dynamics are present in the economic sphere as well as in the sort of traditional military and security sphere, where that concept was first set out. I think next to that, there's a question of escalation dominance, which is, again, a concept that was developed in the sort of military sphere, but is also present in the economic sphere, because we often see in economic relations that you have tit for tat dynamics where one country will punish, the other country will respond by punishing. But then we often see situations where you don't get that, and where one country, because it has a larger economy or because of its own political economic dynamics, feels like it's more capable to mete out costs against its adversaries and not be punished in response. And in the chip industry, that's been the US dynamic. The US has cut off a series of Chinese firms from access to advanced technology, Huawei, for example, being the most prominent example, without really suffering much from China in retaliation. And that's an interesting dynamic as well. It's encouraged the US to do more of that. And I think we're going to see whether China continues to basically accept these moves by the US or decides to push back with its own costly measures.
Because you said that, and because we recently had our TikTok hearings here, do you think that there are enough subject matter experts in the government? Because that was one of the, there was a dip in your book, if you look at the timeline of where there was government and industry working together, there seemed to be in the same conversation, and then there was a dip in kind of knowledge and expertise at the government level here in the US. So do you think that we are rebuilding that? Do you think that we have our congressmen and senators understand what they're talking about? As we're looking ahead to a redo of 2020 election, do these two players understand what's going on? Should we be confident here at the doorstep that our lawmakers understand?
I think one could always want for more expertise in government on all sorts of technical issues. But I think I'm struck by the vast improvement in the government's expertise over the last 5 years. So 5 years ago, it was really hard to find people at the upper echelons of economic policymaking, foreign policymaking, who had much of an expertise in this industry at all. And now I think what you find is that the people who work on these issues have a ton of expertise, and the typical policymaker knows a lot more than they would have 5 years ago. So I think we've actually done an okay job at getting up to speed on this issue. Although I'm sure there are many different ways in which our knowledge could be even better.
And just because both Nick and I went to the School of Foreign Service, I'm going to plug the Netflix show, The Diplomat, because it's really good. But I'm also going to say on the diplomatic level, because a lot of being signaled at the diplomatic level, you mentioned how will China respond? They haven't yet. What is going on at the diplomatic level? And because there's some great stories you have here in the book about spying and how Russia spied on the US in the early days when they tried to get some technology, which, by the way, didn't happen. Is that going to happen to China? I mean, are we, what is the spying situation? What's going on with that and the diplomatic situation? Because I do think in this industry, it matters. I think it matters, even though, it might seem just like a Netflix show. It's very real.
Well, it's interesting. On the one hand, there's been historically a lot of spying in the industry, which I addressed in the book. On the other hand, I think it's hard to find examples of where spying really turned the tables. One of the reasons is that, unlike a lot of other industries, the chip industry improves at exponential rates every 2 years. And that's what Moore's law is all about, doubling of computing power every 2 years from new generations of chips. And what that means is that if you're 10 years behind, you're 5 Moore's laws behind, which means that you're in the Stone Ages. And so in an industry that improves so rapidly, spying can only get you so far. And it's different from many other spheres. I think of aviation, which is a really complex type of manufacturing. They do some extraordinary things in aviation. But I like to imagine, well, what if planes flew twice as fast every 2 years? It'd be in a totally different world. We'd be halfway to Mars by the time we've been on this call. And in that industry, because the rate of improvement is slower, spying is more impactful because you have time to integrate what you've learned into your systems. Now, it's still been hard to spy in aviation, and aviation engines are still one of the things that it's very, very hard to replicate. But I think it's more impactful there than in the chip industry, where in the time it takes to spy and to apply whatever you've learned, the industry's already jumped forward, doubling its capacity relative to 2 years ago. And so it's just not a great strategy.
Well, and then also, as you said, great, I can get I've stolen the plans for your latest chip, but if I don't have the capacity to replicate it, that is, that I can go to my factories and say, here's the design, now make this. As you were pointing out, the cost and complexity issues are real barriers there. As we're beginning to wrap up, I mean, it's interesting, you titled your book Chip War, right? That chip wars, right? That there's this sense of conflict, of competition. Wars can carry with them also the prospect for loss. Do you think that people are really, we talk in the abstract about, well, we use chips for everything. And as you said, we could end up in a Great Depression situation where a lot of things that we take for granted would not be manufactured. New planes, new cars, not just, an iPhone 20 version or something like that. Do you think that this kind of ties back to the expertise question that Tatiana raised. Do you think that realization of how ubiquitous chips are in everyday products, one point in the past, I mean, I've always used this example. I was that MasterCard ad from a few years ago with Camila Cabello, essentially with her smartphone buying all of these goods and services while she's walking down a Brooklyn street. That people just sort of think these things just sort of appear. The goods just are made. I go to the store and I need a dishwasher. I go to Home Depot. It's there. Do you get a sense from the people you've been talking with that there is this understanding of the level of economic disruption? Or is it still largely abstract? I mean, when you've been on book tours, you've been around the country, you've been taking questions from people. Do you get a sense that that the seriousness of the consequences are there, or is it still largely an abstract? Yeah, let's like a meteor. Yeah, a meteor could hit Earth and it would be really bad, but
I think we still have some really severe cognitive dissonance over this issue. I think if you were to ask someone, a typical person 5 years ago, and ask them today, what's the likelihood of something going wrong in the Taiwan Straits over the next 5 or 10 years, I think almost everyone would give you a higher probability today than 5 years ago. But I think if you ask people, what costs would you be willing to bear to address that risk today? The answer is, well, not all that much. And we see that in the way that companies make decisions. We see it in the way that the governments make decisions. And I think it's basically an irrational result of our difficulty in planning for crises in the future. Because no matter what probability you put on the worst case scenario, the cost is measured in the many trillions of dollars. And so you ought to be willing to buy a very expensive insurance policy right now to begin to prepare for that. And we can debate what the best way is to prepare for that. We can debate, but I think we're not doing nearly enough to prepare for that scenario, even though I think it's not the most likely outcome, even though I think we still can avoid a crisis, even though I hope that it doesn't happen. I still think just the reality that it's certainly above zero. And I'm afraid it's above a 10 or 20% probability over the next 5 years. And so I think we ought to be doing more to prepare.
One way to prepare, just reminding our audience, is to get Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology by Chris Miller, You will learn a lot about many things. You've done so much research. You've talked to so many people. I want to talk about some of the sources because I like to leave our audience always with where they could get more information. Your book, some of the sources that I found were that you mentioned, if people want to just learn more about the chip industry, especially in China, was the Nikkei Asia reference that you made. You did a lot of work with Georgetown or alma mater's research. Is there anywhere else that you found that was really helpful in putting this book together that our audience can follow current developments kind of as they happen?
Well, I think you mentioned the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown. I would just reiterate the fact they do extraordinary work on not only semiconductors, but also all other types of advanced technologies, AI, biotechnology, and its implications for security. So I learned a lot from them, and I think all of your listeners would too.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. We hope to see you soon for your next book. If you want to share with us, we'll be willing to listen what your next book is. But for now, Chip Wars, read it, buy it, talk to us online about it. We want to hear from you.